The term clienthood became popular throughout the post-colonial era to describe the near-colonial past, where in colonized land, indigenous elites formed pragmatic ties with the colonizers to ensure stability, especially their own, emancipate themselves, and gain privileges that the Western class had to offer. In the 19th to 20th centuries, historians enjoyed applying this term to talk about the antiquity, especially regarding one of the most expansive colonies, just the Romans. Hey everyone, it's your host Olivia, and welcome to the first episode of Rumors from the Ruins, where we gossip about the ancient guys. In this video, I'm taking a topic from this one midterm assignment that my professor in grad school handed out in the very first meeting of our course. And by the way, it's a course on ancient political thoughts and system. So we're going to be very political today. We had to do a thesis critique, and he wanted us to find something that's related to our thesis. And my thesis topic takes place in the first century, highlighting the separation of Christians from their Jewish roots, merging with Hellenistic identity. I'm not trying to find the same exact topic, but I found a thesis made in Leiden University, written by Simon Joosten, supervised by Professor Joosten, titled Romanization and the Judean Elite. Why did the Romanization of Judea fail despite pro-Roman sentiment amongst the Judean elite? And going on from this thesis I reviewed, I will walk you through the case of colonialism and imperialism in the ancient Roman Empire, in its relations with the Jewish revolt and the roles of Jewish elites of this late antiquity within this issue of peace and conflict. I will drop the link also of Joosten's master thesis in the description below if you'd like to do some independent reading. And in order to provide you with an overview of the discussion, this research addresses Romanization and indigenous elites, the development of Roman influence in Palestine from before 67 BCE to post-Herodian era, the indigenous elites and the revolt, and closed with the chapter that answers why did Romanization fail in the first century Judea, despite the existence of those indigenous elites. So the author starts off by quoting Herod Agrippa II's speech in 66 AD in the beginning of the Jewish War. Had I found you all bent on war with the Romans, instead of seeing that the most honest and single-minded members of the community are determined to preserve the peace, I should not have presented myself before you, nor ventured to offer advice, for any speech in support of the right policy is thrown away when the audience anonymously favors the worse. The speech recorded by Josephus in the book Jewish War shows how Herod Agrippa II, as an indigenous elite, prevented the people of Jerusalem from revolting on purpose of keeping the society cohesive, but he was only one amongst Jewish elites in Palestine who played a role in the dynamics of Romanization, including the turmoils that came as a reaction, just like the Jewish wars between the 66 to 70 AD. But before we look through the phenomenon, it's crucial to have a critical perception on what Romanization actually is. There are two important views compared in this thesis. The first one coined by Francis Haverfield in his book, The Romanization of Roman Britain. His definition involves how the Roman elites were civilizing the locals, and published in the year 1912, it makes sense how this understanding reminds us on imperialism and colonialism, which took place at that time. The other concept came later on in 1990. British archaeologist Martin Millet drew a more neutral concept of a process where Roman culture was fused with the local culture, in which a new culture later took form. This means the indigenous people also had influenced the new colony, but this theory seems flawed. For example, some factors like the role of a lay people and the Roman government itself were left out, while Roman policy strongly determined the Romanization, including how they created a relationship structure between them and the predating populations through the rulers. We shouldn't forget how the imperial Romans were strong on promulgating their culture. And when I saw this thesis, I was intrigued anyway, for Joosten's approach is pretty much on understanding the ancient using a modern concept, drawing the socio-political reality of the past with contemporary comprehension. It helps giving a sense of proximity between us and the ancient past because it sounds really far away and untouchable. They say we can never go back to the past. And modern people like to romanticize the ancient, how their thoughts are amplified on a different level, but human thoughts and needs didn't seem to change. We've always been attempting to fulfill our needs of security, power, wealth, and abundance. And those concepts that mankind had just recently defined on colonization, imperialism, cultural assimilation, so on and so forth, have always been there and will continue. I'm coming from a post colonial nation, and the concept of indigenous elites seeking pragmatic relations with the colonizers is such a familiar concept. The local elites of Java, from my homeland, for example, had always been in the same social clubs with the Dutch. It's related to political mobility, fusion of political thoughts, and also group survival. The case that we're looking at in this review, though, takes place between the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE in Roman Judea, consisting of many ethnicities, yet highlighting the relations between the Romans and the Jews. The Jews was not a single domain. It's way more layered and diverse. And we're talking polarities like Hellenized Jews, anti-Hellenistic Jews, anti-Roman, pro-Roman, and they were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, Essenes, and the Zealots who demonstrated political traits of their own. And what does it have to do with Romanization? So according to Joosten, the Jewish War is the event that signaled failed process of Romanization in Judea. So the aim of this research is to understand the reason behind the failure of Romanization in the 1st century Judea. The writer heavily relies on Flavius Josephus as the primary source. Josephus' background is a determining factor of how objective our conclusions are, because Josephus, born in 37 CE, is only a Latin name for Yosef ben Matityahu, a guy from the priestly group. In the Jewish hierarchy, priestly families were part of the elites. So in Josephus' life period, his group was the client of the Flavian dynasty, and he wrote series of books narrating events from the Hasmonean, Herodian era up to Jewish war. As a Greco-Romanized Jews, we might say that Josephus' view leans toward the pro-Roman sentiment, although he barely mentioned how many Roman policies violated the Jewish law and how many governors and procurators applied unethical practices. For instance, procurator Pontius Pilate in 26 AD, assigned by Emperor Tiberius in Judea, provoked rebellious sentiment by using the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. As we get through the thesis, we'd repeatedly stumble upon similar issue. Jewish laws were violated, and local elites assigned delegations to negotiate with the Roman policy, and so on and so forth. And when we see it this way, the weakness of local elites indicated stronger tendency to Haverfield's theory on Romanization, where the other part is more dominant. And identical to many colonial studies, Western-centric or colonizer-centric views have consistently been a concern to the objectivity of these studies. Here too, Joosten expresses concern on Roman-centric view, although there's not much we can do as ancient sources are limited. He only used Josephus' work as his primary source, and the initial description of Romanization came from the Western world. Researchers beneath the nuance of British imperial colonization justified the practices of civilizing the Orients. The Romans were seen as a conqueror, the messiah for modernization to the under-civilized. Martin Millet, with his update on the definition, argued that Romanization played out as a dialectical shift where two cultures influenced each other. Since the Augustan era, however, the Roman Empire became more centralized, that native elites had to be politically integrated with them. And Joosten was aware that Millet's theory has lack of attention to the non-elite population, so he added alternative theories that might be more suitable to portray Romanization, such as the Jane Webster's model of creolization. So lower social classes also led the Romans to engage with the culture, including cult, traditions, and spoken languages. Another alternative concept offered is discrepant identity, coined by David J. Mattingly in his book Imperialism, Power, and Identity. This concept, too, describes how different cultures influence each other without identifying how less or more they've done it. There's no direct case study in Judea yet, and these comparisons came from research on Romanization in other regions like Africa and Britain, taking comparison from the Cisalpine Gaul in the 3rd century BCE. Purcell in 2002 mentioned three factors of Romanization, namely colonization, road network, and centuriation. And by the way, centuriation means a land survey method to reshape arable land and redistribute it among the colonizers and natives. In the Greek Mediterranean, Romanization did not interfere much with the local cultural values because roads and centralized networks were considered more valuable to them. And the other way around, the Greeks had much materialistic and intellectual influences toward the Romans. In the Hellenized East, the act of civilizing couldn't be applicable to describe Romanization. Romanization in the Hellenized area focused more on the military and political changes to integrate the East under the Roman rule. They renamed and reorganized provinces, especially the urban areas, while also merging the local structures, including the Hellenized elements and networks, into Roman policy according to their likings, meaning that these should not be against the religion and cultural identity. And this is cited from Wolff's Roman urbanization of the East. In fact, Hellenization had prepared the East for Romanization because it affects the way how they interacted with the Roman policies later on. Romanization in the Jewish civilization can be divided into three stages of crisis, and the first one being the oppression of the Jews by the Seleucid, happening in the 2nd century BCE and followed by the succession crisis, where the Romans intervened after the death of Alexandra Salome or Shlamtion, the Pharisee regnant queen of the Hasmonean dynasty. And lastly, the death of Herod, circa 4 BCE. Pragmatic political takes had been used by local rulers since the Hellenistic era, and the Hasmonean kingdom too used to rebel against the Seleucid and Ptolemy's influence, and it shared similar costs with the revolt against the Roman. Which was the procurator's policies that disadvantaged the Jews. While the Seleucids highly controlled the religious sector, the Ptolemies were more tolerant and they focused more on the population enforcement. The Hasmonean dynasty complied with some Hellenistic identities to secure their position, even breaking some traditions, such as how John Hyrcanus used treasures from the David's tomb to pay for mercenaries, and in the time of Aristobulus, carrying the name Philhellen, meaning a lover of Greek culture. He was a high priest while at the same time instituting a monarchy system. And instead of recruiting Jewish armies, he aided mercenaries, leading to the success of his expansion. However, with the succession crisis between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, Roman client state period entered the chronology. Hyrcanus and Antipater ended up given the power by the Roman, while Hyrcanus was only a puppet. And perhaps one of the reasons why the independent Jewish power continued to dwindle was that whenever an opportunity surfaced, the elite chose to cooperate with Romans instead, and 67 BCE was a client state period for Judea. For the first time, there happened to be a direct military intervention from the Roman in the kingdom, and in 63 BCE, the coastal and northern part that used to belong to the Hasmoneans were annexed by Pompey. Then, Roman colonial architecture, material culture, and administration was introduced to the area. And in 37 BCE, Herod became a Roman vassal king. It was not without resistance from the conservative groups, of course, but it remained successful, at least until Herod's death. So, yeah, the Herodian legitimacy initially were capable of keeping the stability in Judea. they regularly paid tribute in many forms. And in 4 BCE, Judea utterly turned into a Roman colony. Joosten included an archaeological finding here where in the Client State period there was a search in local Jewish pottery. He wrote that this might be a cultural rejection to Romanization where people chose to adhere to their own lifestyle. Economically, Judea was integrated to the Roman economy or the Mediterranean common market, and the elite class began to earn Roman education administered in the Roman army. Then there grew a striking gap between the elites and the peasants. So who are those Judean elites? In general, elite can be defined as the governing class, and political elite hence consists of the priests and the aristocrats. They're indicated by the possession of power in certain area, in this case in Judea. In the third chapter of the thesis, Joosten introduces and discusses the traits of the Jewish revolt, including the parties and the political factions as well as their thought. The Judean government foundation was theocratic, but it slowly changed after the Hasmonean dynasty. King Herod took a braver move on being a king who appointed the priest upon him, for Herod himself was mixed blood and he's not from the priestly class. In the meantime, there were big political groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Pharisees was the group who were mostly Jewish teachers, but ironically pragmatic, finding loopholes in terms of political practices and its consonance with the Jewish law. And oral culture was very popular among them. The Essenes, according to Josephus, was also a group of a more conforming people who weren't really involved in politics until the ascendance of King Herod. They were mostly celibate, sober, and probably esoteric. The Sadducees got their name from their forebears, the priestly Sadokid families, derived from the word Sadik, means righteous. And these local Jewish groups clashed sometimes, like in the 67 BCE when Alexander Salome's son, Hyrcanus II, and Aristobulus II conflicted, involving the Pharisees and Sadducees who both competed for Romans' support. But then Aristobulus' son Antigonus had allied with the Persians to take over Judea, so that the Romans turned to Herod. And here a new political system was established. Herod was legitimized as a king of the house of David, modifying theocracy and even having nearly absolute power. Both Pharisees and Sadducees weakened in this period. The empire benefited from this. They were able to create a body of a loyal indigenous elite to serve their interests. And because Herod was partially Idumean, these Idumean had the privilege of Herod's patronage as well. Herod reorganized the influential demography into more multicultural and withdrew further from the grassroots. Fearing that theocracy would come back, his strategy was to authorize the temple and collect the loyal elites to back him up. So, what kind of guy Herod could be? Well, he enjoyed the existence of the plural cult. He's more of a secular and allowed the Romans with no issue to bring the imperial cult alongside their pantheon and symbols in Jerusalem. The temple gate had the imperial eagle during his reign, and the fanatics couldn't do much to denounce his style. And the high priest, especially, could no longer be in strong control of the Roman policy implementation. Still, the elites of a temple had more prominent socio-cultural and political role compared to the Jews in the diaspora. There were about 1,000 clerks in the first century only to perform rituals and scripture recital. They're not on board once every 6 months. They usually worked as teachers or the magistrates. I'll take an external source, and you may want to read the article of Eyal Regev titled Herod's Jewish Ideology Facing Romanization on Intermarriage, Ritual Bath, and Speeches. Herod didn't simply take off his Jewish identity. Yes, he enjoyed foreign customs like the theater, amphitheater, and sports competitions, but he also implemented an intermarriage law that secured the patrilineal Jewish bloodline. So Jewish men, for example, could marry unconverted Gentiles and their children would still be Jewish, but not the other way around. He also built the mikvah in the Roman bathhouses, perfectly functional for the Jews. In his speech, Herod expressed that Romanization was good for securing religious freedom, especially in the diasporic lands. After Herod's reign came to an end, peasantry had more space to flourish. They issued a petition for tax reduction, one of the initial democratic practices and a seed of revolutionary movement. In chapter 4, Joosten analyzed that it was an irony how before the spasm of Jewish civil war, a cooperation happened between the pro-Roman elites and the revolutionary groups. There's one important Roman figure, Procurator Florus, who showed more favor to the Greeks and abused the Jews into exclusion. At this point, even the pro-Roman elites couldn't continue supporting the procurator. The first faction that resisted against Florus was led by Eleazar ben Ananias in 66 AD, then became popular as a representation of the ruling class who initiated the revolt. When we see a political figure like this, we shouldn't immediately jump into conclusion that they did it on behalf of the lower to middle class. Eleazar himself was probably still in need of the Romans' favor. He also symbolically destroyed the property belonged to his father, who was a high priest, and drew sympathy from the people, showing off that he's not oppressive like the other Jewish elites. He refused to partake in the Roman temple sacrifice. His political take was perceived as heroic. Still, he's a politician and he can be utilitarian. On the other side of the polar, Agrippa II maintained his pro-Roman take, assisted the empire militarily and financially by means of avoiding tensions, to be loyal and being not against the Roman. What happened during the revolt? The political action definitely had separate reasons as well. There were some with socioeconomic motives, and the revolt was intended to show aggression against the economic burdens. So this group burned down the archives of the city, besides the Antonia Castle and Herodian palaces, to erase the records of their debt. They aimed to redistribute the wealth that once was centered to the pro-Roman Jews from the ruling class. But same as modern political contestation, there were also groups with more traditional or religious motives. The Zealots were on the side, with a demagogue named Menachem, who led with a king outfit. The things that the Romans and the Jewish elites did that bothered them were more of a dismissal of theocratic system. They refused to sacrifice to the pagan gods, observing obedience to the Caesar. They wanted to turn Judea back into being led by a high priest. Joosten quoted Hegel in this, that the Zealots fought in their holy war. In September of 66 AD, Roman Syrian governor Cestius Gallus was sent to take over the region, but his troop was entrapped by the Jews along their way, and at this point, factional gaps grew wider. The two opposing goals were first to maintain the status quo of being a Roman client state, and the other goal was to have a Jewish state. For the second group, the revolt wasn't completely successful because of a local leadership wasn't unified and turned feeble. Our philological source, Josephus, was a witness of this event. He fortified Galilee despite having indicative Roman sentiment. This attitude was in a way inevitable to be saved, to be politically accepted. One of the revolutionary leader from the Sadducee group, High Priest Ananus, still attempted to seek the possibility of peacemaking with the Romans. Of course, it heated more tension with the Zealots, at least until a Galilean leader and a hero trusted by the Jews, John of Gischala, could negotiate with this more conservative group. Here, we can see how both Romanization and the revolt weren't fully successful. Another group worth mentioning is the Sicaries, who were the assassins. They're more fanatical during the revolt. The Romanization had to encounter resistance, yet it still had control in the area. In 69 AD, Judea was reconquered during the emperorship of Vespasianus. He sent his son Titus with 4 legions formed to march with him, besieging Jerusalem. And it was the downfall of the temple, indeed. So to rejuvenate the synergy between Jewish factions were already inconceivable. It decentralized Jewish diasporas in other areas from Asia Minor to Egypt. a reconstruction never actually happened. Zangenberg, who supervised the thesis, wrote in his work Peace from the Ashes that Judea became less Jewish since then. Temple tax was replaced by capitularium allocated to the Capitoline Temple of the Roman, and only small Jewish elites could hold on to their power following the Jewish War. One of the first political moves done by the Romans after the revolt was to reorganize the territory with the road system. Joosten wrote, throughout these events, there were 5 different agendas. The first one was the removal of Florus as procurator, and the second one, the appeasement of Rome and peace. The third one, the removal of the economically oppressive indigenous dominant elite. The fourth one, independence from Rome. And the first one, the reinstatement of theocratic regime in Judea. Before I continue to my own analysis on his thesis, let's see how the author concludes it. First of all, linking this to Millet's theory, those Jewish elites started at becoming reliable to the Roman colonizers who subdued their provinces, who needed to navigate themselves in a new conquered area. On the other hand, the Jewish elites too enjoyed the privilege of patronage given by the Romans, and this interaction created a new Roman elite culture in the Judean political sphere. But why Romanization ended up failing? The thesis mainly argues that as the Jewish elites gradually were detached from the lower class population, they could no longer retain the dominance over the area. The alteration from high priesthood to kingship that developed over time throughout the Hasmonean to Herodian period contributed to the internal divides of social classes and political alliances of the Jews. For instance, under King Herod, priesthood was controlled beneath the kingdom. He also involved non-Jewish elites in his circle. In post-Herod's death, his successor, Agrippa I, followed by Agrippa II, were also favored by the Romans for allowing their political thoughts and systems to prevail. Yet concurrently, in Agrippa's time, the Roman control over the temple had become more indirect, declining together with the loyalty of the Jews to the Romans. The peak of a trigger came when Procurator Florus ruled in 64 to 66 AD. His unethical policies towards the Jews, such as taking temple money, ignited the outrage of local Judeans. And this revolt was not solely against the Romans, but also the Jewish rulers who happened to be pro-Roman, which made it a civil war. So we can see how the Jews were factions, some who focused on socioeconomic concerns, while the rest of them were based more on religious factor. The Roman elites were seen as violating the tradition and theocratic legitimacy. In conclusion, Romanization failed because the Jewish society itself was scattered into multiple factions, as the elites lost touch of its grassroots, made it harder to cooperate. We've reached the end of this reading, and what's my take on this research? Genuinely, it encompasses an interesting case study applying Romanization theory to understand an imperial failure of inflicting its system, thought, and culture into a particular civilization that has been long-standing. And the bedrock of these events was encounter of different political thoughts, a form of monotheistic theocracy disrupted by pagan imperialism. Romanization was colonialism, imperialism, and at the same time, creolization. Isn't it hard to put it into a confining label? However, I recognize several conceptual, methodological, and argumentative weaknesses that could be discerned. First of all, the Romanization framework is applied inconsistently and kind of insufficiently. It retreats to Millet's elite emulation model on grounds that it fits the Judean case because elites were central to the revolt. And the author selects a theoretical framework because it aligns with the outcome he wished to explain. Having acknowledged that Millet's model is still lacking in 3 ways. The first one is its elite centrism, its dependence on emulation, and also the marginalization of Roman governmental agency. The author still proceeds to use the model anyway without adequately compensating for these deficiencies. The stated intention to adjust it to fit the Judean reality for me, it's never clearly executed. So what adjustments are actually made? Because the thesis didn't seem to specify a modified theoretical framework with clear conceptual parameters, and instead it simply narrates events through an assumed lens of Millet's theory. I personally think the failure of Romanization was vaguely defined. There's no comparative metric for the failure. For instance, one could argue that Romanization ultimately succeeded after the Jewish War, the post 70 CE reorganization of the province, the destruction of a temple cult, the imposition of the Fiscus Judaicus, and the later integration of Rabbinic Judaism into a Roman civic framework all represents dimensions of provincial absorption. When it comes to methodology, the thesis I reviewed had nearly total dependence on Josephus. He acknowledged that Josephus was a Pharisee, a Roman client, and a part of the priestly elite, and with the renowned biases, we would require the perspective of non-elite Jews, the peasants, the women, slaves, and diaspora communities, which are almost entirely absent from this research because it's unseen by Josephus. Exploration of material culture or archaeological works would also make this research even richer, such as in Judea, Galilee, Sepphoris, Magdala, and Jerusalem. At one point, this thesis mentioned that the dominant elite in Herodian era was alienated from the population, but it's rather implicitly assumed than demonstrated, and other than that, the role of religion is underrated. It was acknowledged that there was a shift from theocratic system to a client kingship. Actually, Herodian era was a very interesting time. If you want to deep dive about Romanization of cult to strengthen his Roman backing, as an instance, Herod wanted to consolidate Roman ideologies into the temple complex. I found an MA thesis with a more narrow scope about Herodian legitimacy. It was written by Louis James Polcin in UBC Canada, titled Mosaics of Identity, Herodian Legitimization Through Localized Cultic Toleration. In the thesis that I'm reviewing, though, religious life and religious-based movements related to class conflicts were mentioned secondarily after the economic factors. And even so, we need more exposure of what the economic condition of the peasants looked like before the revolt. About the Roman policies, you can also read administrative development in the kingdoms and principalities of the Near East under the aegis of Rome by Donald Allen MacLennan. It's a PhD thesis written in Durham University. There's also an archaeological research titled Jewish Life Before the Revolt, the Archaeological Evidence. The author is Andrea M. Berlin. Berlin's work might challenge the claim that Romanization failed because while the Jews were religiously unified, they were culturally scattered, and it hastened the victory of the empire. Most importantly, it was proven by material evidences like kitchen potteries, stone vessels, and burial sites. Before I close the camera, I have some lingering questions that you might want to research yourself. So the first one is Millet's model is inadequate and didn't fit much, similar to Haverfield's model. So how do we modify this theoretical concept to understand the Judean case? Number two, what could be different if we don't rely solely on a writer under Flavian patronage? What could we get from writers other than Josephus? Number three, is there any evidence that supports that if only the indigenous elites were to be more deeply rooted, it would have prevented the revolt? And the last one, how did the Roman policy itself contribute to the conflict involving the indigenous group? So if you have something in mind, please comment down below. Also, let me know if you have any topics that you'd like me to discuss in Rumors from the Ruins. Hope you enjoyed this video. Bye-bye.